Desert maps are some of the least popular maps in Fire Emblem, despite there being at least one in most Fire Emblem games. I'm going to talk about the issues with desert maps and what makes the good ones work in this video. And I'll be focusing on Chapter 15 of Sacred Stones, Scorched Sand, as it's my favorite desert map in the series, and I think it shows how you can use the quirks of desert mechanics to make a great map. I'm going to be using footage from my 0% growths run of Sacred Stones, so if you notice that I'm playing the map kinda slow, that's why. Let's start with how desert maps work, and why they tend to be unpopular. Desert map mechanics vary a bit throughout the series, but the common traits are that the maps are loaded with desert tiles that reduce the movement of all of your troops, except for footlocked magic users and flyers. They also often include hidden items that units have a chance of picking up if they end their turn in specific spaces. Typically, thieves are guaranteed to find the item while other units have a luck % chance. Those are the basic mechanics. Let's look at the reasons why people tend not to like these maps. The big one that you'll hear a lot is the movement penalty. Limited mobility punishes foot units and cavalry really heavily, while spotlighting flyers and magic units. The issue here is that in a lot of Fire Emblem games, flyers are already one of the best unit types, while footlocked weapon users typically struggle in comparison. So desert maps often spotlight units that are already doing well, and penalize units that are already struggling to shine. Armor Knight enjoyers have it rough enough without a map that reduces them to one move. Beyond how the movement penalties affect different unit types though, they can also just make a desert map take a long time, particularly if you don't have a lot of powerful flyers available. If you have to seize, your lord has to trundle through the desert or be ferried by a flyer, or if it's a route map, you might have to labor through the desert to each corner of the map to complete the objective. The hidden desert items are another sticking point in desert maps. Often these items are pretty important. For example, in Sacred Stones, we have our only warp staff hidden in the desert. In Path of Radiance, there's an entire character recruitment on a hidden desert tile, and in Fire Emblem 6, there are boots, a speed wing, and a warp hidden in the desert. Point being, these are items that you're going to want and you don't want to miss them. There's not a great way to find all of them on a blind playthrough though. Often a hidden item will be next to some interesting landmark, like a pile of bones on the map, but sometimes there's nothing indicating anything special is there. So there are basically two options for a new player. Play blind and potentially miss some important items, none of which are necessary to beat the game, but often are a drag not to have, or look up a guide. Looking up a guide is fairly painless, but ideally players should be able to play these maps blind without fear of missing out on recruitments or super important items, because what if they don't even know they need to look up a guide? So those are the major issues with desert maps. They can be slow, cryptic, and punish footlocked units that already historically struggle in Fire Emblem games. But let's look at Chapter 15, Scorched Sand and Sacred Stones. This is my favorite desert map in the series, and I want to talk about what this map does to avoid some of the desert map problems, as well as what can be improved here. Scorched Sand has two possible start positions. Either you start with your army on the bottom left corner of the map, with Erika, Sale, and Inez starting in the north, or you start with your army in the north, while Ephraim, Dusel, and Noel arrive early on in the map in the bottom left. Either way, your armies start on opposite sides of a desert that fills the middle of the map. Crucially, the vast majority of enemies are either in the north or the south, not in the desert. This means that your foot units have something to do without ever entering the desert. If your main army starts in the south, for example, they have this whole bottom area with tons of enemies and a boss that they can fight without ever being slowed down by desert terrain. The desert is still important though, because it prevents you from immediately merging your armies. The side that you don't start on is only going to have 3 units, but there are plenty of enemies for them to fight, so you might want to send some units over from your bigger force to help them. This is where the desert comes in. You can send some support by ferrying units with flyers or sending magic units, but you can't totally merge your armies right away. This is great because the map clearly wants us to be fighting 2 battles here, the battle in the south against Valter and the battle in the north against Kalak. Instead of fighting in the desert, which is frustrating and slow, the desert is used more as an obstruction to keep your units separated, but without totally removing the option to move your units to either side if you're willing to take the map slow or send a flyer. In a lot of desert maps, flyers and sages end up doing 90% of the combat, but in Scorched Sands, all of your combat units have a great chance to contribute. Scorched Sand also includes a nice mix of enemies. Kalak's forces are a bunch of footlocked physical units that aren't going to be crossing the desert in a timely manner, whereas Valters are a mix of horses and wyverns, and then there's also a lot of Pegasus reinforcements. This means that each side has a fair amount of enemies that are unlikely to cross the desert, but the wyverns and Pegasi can complicate crossing the desert for you if you haven't dealt with them yet. The principle that I think can be taken from this aspect of Scorched Sand is that desert maps are more fun when the entire map isn't desert. It's better when the desert is an interesting obstruction or provides meaningful side objectives for flyers to tackle while still leaving pockets of the map where foot units can make great contributions. Speaking of side objectives, that brings up something that Scorched Sand can improve on, which is the hidden items. Scorched Sand is loaded with hidden items including the boots, a warp staff, and the silver card. There are two problems. First, a blind player is likely to miss some of these items, and that's a shame because endgame Sacred Stones is a lot more fun when warp is available. The second problem is that there's no urgency on this objective. Scorched Sand is a route map with limited reinforcements and bosses that don't move. So if you aren't playing with a self-imposed turn count limitation, the hidden items are more like a chore than an interesting objective. There's just a thing you fly around collecting at the end of the map. They can be interesting in contexts like low turn count playthroughs where you have to decide which items are worth getting and grab them up in a timely manner. But in a casual playthrough, these hidden items don't add too much to the map, beyond that it's kind of neat finding magical artifacts like the Metis Tome in the desert. The first problem of the desert items being very cryptic is easy to solve, and I see two good ways to do it. One is that you could lower the amount of items but hint at where each item is. Maybe Kalak could mention something about ordering his soldiers to dig around his location because he heard there was treasure there. Now players know to look around where Kalak is, and they'll find the warp staff. The village and houses could each hint at the location of an item as well, that way it's more of a puzzle to find the items versus stumbling around until you find everything. Another option would be to just make the hidden item spaces stand out in some way. You could add a little glimmer to a space that contains an item, for instance. This would make the items more like the desert version of treasure chests. It would remove some of the mystery of finding a desert item randomly, but a lot of people just look these item locations up anyway, so I don't know that too much is lost from handling it in this way. Another option, if you want to keep the mystery of people randomly stumbling upon them, is you could just not put important items in the desert. It doesn't feel so bad to miss a killer lance, but it does feel bad to miss a warp or a recruitable character. The second problem, the hidden items having no urgency, is a little bit trickier, but I think there are a few ways to resolve it. The first requires us to change the map objective. If the map were kill boss instead of route, we could simply have the bosses start moving after a certain number of turns. This would force us to either finish the map or die trying, so there wouldn't be an unlimited amount of time to scour the desert for items. This is my preferred solution, as I think kill both bosses would be a better objective for this map anyway. Scorched Sand is a really hyped story moment, and a big part of that is because it's the Valter and Kalak map. They should be the focus of the map, and making them the objective and letting them move would add some urgency and prevent the issue of the end of the map being kinda boring because you might be crawling through the desert to kill the last reinforcement to complete the route objective. If we don't want to make the bosses move though, another option would be to just put the items on a timer. You could add enemy thieves that can pick the items up like chests and other maps, or simply say after a certain amount of turns the items are forever buried in the sand. I don't like this solution as much as the kill boss solution, as the bosses coming at you feels a lot less arbitrary than just putting a time limit on the items, but if you didn't want to make the bosses move, this would work too. Another solution is that you could just not have hidden desert items, which is the path a lot of more recent Fire Emblem games have taken. Personally, I like the idea of hidden desert items. They add something unique to the map, and it helps sell the age and history of the desert, but I think some adjustments could be made to hidden desert items to make them less cryptic for new players and less of a chore for more experienced players. So overall, Scorched Sand works well because it doesn't limit your movement everywhere, and it uses the desert as an obstruction that reinforces the split army aspect of the map. It could make some improvements on how desert items are handled, and I really wish the objective was kill bosses instead of route, but for me it's the most fun desert map in the series, and I think the clever use of the desert in the middle of the map is a big part of that. Of course, you can also solve the issues with desert maps by completely changing how the desert works. Fire Emblem Engage does this, so let's take a look at Chapter 12, The Sentinels. This map removes the typical desert terrain tiles and instead adds quicksand, which only reduces your movement if you start your turn in it. I found this mechanic to not be annoying, but also to be largely ignorable. A lot of my clears of this map involve almost no one taking the movement penalty, because it's really easy to maneuver your units so that they don't have to end their space in the quicksand. It's a neat take on a desert, but I think they could have used more of the quicksand tiles so that you feel a little more compelled to interact with the mechanic. Or maybe they could have started the villagers in quicksand so that you have to enter to protect them from enemies. Still, I like the quicksand idea. It gives flyers a bit more mobility, and it's a good way to make sure footlocked units and cavalry can move around well in a game where there's no pair-up or rescue, which means flyers can't just ferry people around. Additionally, the existence of quicksand does affect the map even if you don't step in it. You do have to think about how you maneuver around it, and it creates a bunch of spaces where you really only want your flyers to end their turn. So it does add some strategic wrinkles to the map, even if it's not as impactful as I would have liked it to be. The real fun part about the desert map in Engage is the routing. It's a low enemy density map with reinforcements, so it's never overwhelming, and if you play fast, you can even finish it before the reinforcements spawn, which I found to be a pretty fun challenge. Plus, protecting the villagers is pretty easy, but I still think it's one of the more fun side objectives in Fire Emblem Engage. That said, I don't think the routing and side objectives are significantly enhanced by the desert, so I think the ideas here could be a good template for future desert maps, but I would like it if the desert terrain felt a little more essential to the map than it does in the Sentinels. Overall, when it comes to desert maps, I think if we want to stick with the more traditional desert mechanics, problems start to arise when the desert is all of the map or most of the map, especially if you don't have enough powerful flyers to get through them quickly. Desert maps are at their best when the desert plays an important role in the map but doesn't cover the whole thing. This ensures flyers get a chance to shine, but that other units still have areas where they can contribute. Additionally, hidden desert items could be reworked to be a more interesting time-intensive objective rather than something you either don't look up and miss out on, or look up and just spend some time collecting at the end of the map. On the other hand, Engage shows us that we don't have to be married to these desert mechanics at all, and it's also valid to look at new ways to make desert maps work, like Chapter 12 The Sentinels does. But how do you think desert maps can be improved? Or do you like them how they are? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, and if you liked the video, consider hitting the like or subscribe button so that you never miss an upload. We also have a community Discord that you'll find linked in the video description, so check that out if you want to chat about Fire Emblem, and have an awesome week.